She was 18 years old, and she had nowhere else to go. No parents left to speak of, no dowry, no promise of protection, only a single trunk of clothes, a small leather-bound notebook that had belonged to a housekeeper who had loved her, and 42 pounds saved shilling by shilling from 3 years of quiet work in another woman's kitchen. And with that, on a wet March morning in 1856, Claire Mason took possession of a damp and half-forgotten country estate called Ashcombe Hall, handed to her by a duke who fully expected her to fail. But what neither he nor anyone else knew was that behind the shuttered wing at the north end of the house, sealed for nearly 40 years, lay something that would in time undo him and remake her, settle in with a cup of something warm. And if you like stories of quiet women and slow victories, subscribe and tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Claire Mason had been born in a village on the Shropshire border in the spring of 1838, the only child of a country surgeon named Edward Mason and his wife Harriet, who had been a vicar's daughter with a good ear for accounts and a habit of writing everything down. Her father was neither wealthy nor poor, but respectable in the modest way country surgeons were respectable in those years, keeping a pony trap, a small dispensary at the back of the house, and a steady book of patients from 3 parishes. Her mother kept the household ledgers in a slanted, precise hand, and Claire, as soon as she was tall enough to reach the writing desk, was taught to keep them too, so that by 10 she could add a column of shillings and pence faster than the grocer in the high street. And by 12 she knew what a poor rate was, and what a tithe was, and what it meant when a tenant asked for grace until Michaelmas. She was a quiet child, watchful in the way only children who spend a great deal of time near sick rooms learn to be watchful, and she grew up around the smells of ink and iodine and the low murmur of her father's voice explaining, always gently, what could and could not be done. She was 14 when the fever came through the village and carried both her parents off within a fortnight of one another, first her mother and then her father, who had exhausted himself sitting by other people's beds before he sat down beside hers. There was no near family to take her in. A distant cousin in Leicester sent a stiff letter of condolence and a £5 note and said nothing about a home, and the surgeon's practice was sold, and the small house went with it, and Claire, still in mourning black, too big at the shoulders, was placed by the vicar with a childless widow at a country house called Marrowfield, some 12 miles off. Where she was to be, the vicar said carefully, a companion, though in practice she became something between a companion and a scullery help and a bookkeeper. The widow's housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Agnes Lyle, then 59, born in Yorkshire, widowed young, and in service since she was 12 years old. Mrs. Lyle had a long, weathered face, a habit of speaking only when it was needed, and hands that knew the weight of every copper pan in the kitchen without lifting it. She took one look at the thin, tidy girl who had arrived with a black dress and a ledger under her arm, and she quietly decided to teach her everything. Over the next 3 years, she taught Claire how to render a goose and set a jelly, how to boil linen without yellowing it, how to mix a poultice of comfrey and mustard, how to keep bees in a straw skep, and how to move them into a hive without a sting, how to prune an apple in February and a rose in November, how to read a lease, how to spot a false weight on a scale, and how to speak to a man in a frock coat as though she were entirely his equal without ever saying anything he could take offense at. She taught her, too, how to write a letter that got what it asked for in the fewest possible words. At night, in the narrow room above the pantry, Mrs. Lyle would sit with Claire at the small deal table and go through the household accounts, and it was there she gave Claire the small leather-bound notebook she would carry for the rest of her life. It was 6 inches by 4, bound in a dark red calf that had faded to the color of dried rose petals, and inside, In Mrs. Lyle's careful hand were pages of receipts for household use and remedies and rules of thumb. How many pounds of coal a good grate wanted in a day. How to mend a leaded pane with soft lead and putty. How to tell good lime mortar from bad. How much a laborer ought to be paid in the West Country, and how much in the North. On the flyleaf she had written, in that same steady hand, "For Claire, who sees what is worth saving." Mrs. Lyle died in the winter of 1855, quietly, of a chill that turned to pneumonia over a fortnight. And Claire sat with her through the last of it and closed her eyes herself. There was no grand mourning. The widow of Merrowfield, who had grown fond of Claire in her distant way, spoke a few words about kindness, and then 2 months later, the widow herself was taken by a stroke, and the estate passed to a nephew in London who had no need of a young companion, and Claire was given a fortnight to find somewhere else to be. She packed her trunk. She put the red notebook in beside her mother's old ledger and her father's pocket watch, which had stopped the day he died, and which she had never wound again, and she went down to the vicarage to ask what might be done. It was the vicar who, in turn, wrote to a cousin of his who was a solicitor in the county town, and the solicitor, who had a reputation for finding awkward places for awkward problems, wrote back with a curious proposal from a certain Duke of Ellingham, who had, it seemed, a small, unwanted estate on his hands, and was looking, in his own peculiar phrase, for a caretaker willing to be defeated by it. The letter that came back from the county town was 3 short paragraphs on cream-colored paper folded once, and Claire read it standing by the vicarage window, while the vicar's wife pretended to arrange the tea things. The solicitor, a Mr. Harding by name, wrote in the plain style of a man who charged by neither warmth nor apology. His Grace the Duke of Ellingham, he explained, had inherited some years earlier a property called Ashcombe Hall in the neighboring county, together with certain attached farms and cottages, and he had at length concluded that the property could not be made to pay. The house was damp. The roof leaked in 3 places that were known, and probably in others that were not. The rents were in arrears. 2 of the 4 tenant families had given notice within the last 12 months. The steward had left in November and had not been replaced. His Grace, wrote Mr. Harding, was not inclined to spend further money on the place, and was equally not inclined to see it stand empty and be stripped of its lead by parties unknown. He therefore proposed to place a caretaker in the house on a nominal tenancy, at a rent of £1 a year, for a term of 3 years, with the understanding that the caretaker would occupy the house, keep such fires as prevented the plaster from rotting through, and collect what rents the tenants were willing to pay, retaining a portion for her keep. At the end of 3 years, the arrangement would be reviewed. If the caretaker wished to leave earlier, she was free to do so upon a month's written notice. The Duke, Mr. Harding added in the last sentence, was aware of Miss Mason's youth, and considered it a point in her favor, since an older person would understand the position too well to accept it. Claire read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and put it in her pocket. The vicar's wife looked up and asked whether it was bad news, and Claire said that it was not bad news, only news, and that she would answer it in the morning. That night, in the narrow room at Merrowfield, she sat on the edge of her bed with the letter open on her knee and read it a 3rd time by the light of a tallow candle, and she saw perfectly well what it was. It was the kind of offer a man makes when he wants to say afterwards that he tried. He had chosen a girl of 18 because he wished to be able to say, when the roof at last came in, that he had put a caretaker in place and the caretaker had not managed. He had chosen her because she had no one behind her to complain on her behalf. He had chosen her because she was the awkward answer to an awkward problem, and if she failed, the failure would be hers and not his. She understood all of this in the way she had learned to understand a lease at Marrowfield, by reading it slowly and by keeping her face still, and when she had understood it, she blew out the candle and slept. In the morning, she wrote her answer at the vicar's desk in 7 lines. She accepted the tenancy. She asked for a signed copy of the terms. She asked for the name of the nearest coach stop to Ashcombe Hall and the name of any person in the village who might meet her with a cart. She signed the letter Claire Mason in the small, upright hand her mother had taught her, and she gave it to the vicar to seal and post. 2 weeks later, a reply came from Mr. Harding enclosing the signed articles of tenancy on heavy paper, a rough map of the property drawn in brown ink, and a note that a man named John Peck Carter, of the village of Ashcombe, had been engaged to meet the mail coach at the Rose and Crown on the afternoon of the 17th of March. Claire folded these papers into the red notebook. She thanked the vicar and the vicar's wife. She gave the widow's cook a length of black ribbon and the widow's housemaid a pair of good stockings she could not carry. And on the morning of the 16th of March, 1856, with her trunk corded and her bonnet tied and 42 pounds sewn in a linen pouch against her stays, she left Marrowfield in a hired trap, and no one at the gate cried, and neither did she. The mail coach out of the county town went west and then south along the turnpike, and Claire took an outside seat because it was cheaper. And she sat beside a boy going to a farm apprenticeship and a stout woman in a black bonnet who slept the first 2 hours with her chin on her collar. The weather was cold and wet in the way March weather is cold and wet in the middle of England. A fine, steady rain that did not fall so much as hang in the air and settle on wool and hair and the leather seams of luggage, and by the first change of horses her shawl was heavy with it. She watched the country go past, and she catalogued it as Mrs. Lyle had taught her to catalogue a kitchen. Hedgerows well laid, meaning a careful landlord. Hedgerows broken and gap-fenced with hurdles, meaning an absent one. Ricks well thatched, ricks slumping. A church tower with its lead intact. A church tower with sacking over the belfry louvres. Sheep on the higher ground, with their winter fleece still on, and lambs at foot. A dog fox crossing a lane at dusk with something limp in its jaws. She noted these things without writing them down, and by the time the coach stopped at the second inn for the night, she had made a rough estimate of what part of the country she was passing through and what its farms were worth, and she slept 4 hours on a settle in the tap-room, because a bed was 9d and a settle was free. The 17th was worse. The rain grew heavier through the morning, and then thinned into a gray drizzle that made the fields look as though they had been washed and not yet dried. And the coach was late reaching the Rose and Crown, and when it did, she climbed down stiff to the knee with her trunk lowered after her by the guard. And a thin, sandy-haired man in a wet smock came forward and touched the brim of his hat and said, "Miss Mason, I'm Peck." He had brought a low farm cart drawn by a black cob with mud to the hocks, and he handed her up onto the plank seat as though she were a parcel that might break, and he set the trunk in behind and covered it with a piece of oiled canvas, and they went out of the inn-yard at a walk. The lane climbed for 2 miles between dry stone walls patched with moss, and then it dropped through a beechwood where last year's leaves lay black and sodden underfoot, and then it opened onto a shallow valley with a stream at the bottom and a village strung along one side of it. Gray stone cottages, a squat church, a smithy with smoke coming out of the chimney, and 1/2 mile beyond, standing back from the road behind a stand of unpruned lime trees, the house itself. Peck said nothing. He let the cob take its own pace down the slope. Claire looked at the house for a long time as they came toward it. She saw the wet slate of the main roof and the darker patch where a course had slipped. She saw the tall chimneys, 4 of them, none smoking. She saw the sash windows of the south front, several of them cracked and one boarded, and she saw at the far end of the house, at the north, a whole row of shuttered windows behind which no light had been for a very long time. She drew her shawl closer at her throat. She did not speak. She had come to the place she had accepted, and she meant to see it before she said anything at all. Peck brought the cart up the drive at the same unhurried walk, and the wheels ground on wet gravel that had gone half to moss, and the lime trees closed in overhead in a tangle of unpruned suckers, so that the light on Claire's shoulders went suddenly greener and colder. The drive curved once to the left, and delivered them into a forecourt of weeds and pea gravel and standing water. And there Peck drew up in front of the south door, and set the brake and climbed down without a word, and lifted her trunk clear of the cart before he offered his hand to her. Claire stepped down onto the stones and stood for a moment with her boots in a shallow puddle, and looked up at the house that was hers to keep for 3 years at £1 a year. It was a house of local stone, the color of wet oatmeal, 3 stories under a slate roof with a low parapet, 7 bays across the south front, a central door under a plain pediment, and 2 long wings running back from either end into the kitchen court and the stable yard beyond. The stone was sound where she could see it, but the pointing had gone out of the joints in a dozen places, and ivy had climbed the west corner to the eaves and lifted the lead flashing there in a slow, patient wave. The main door was oak, blackened, and set with a brass ring handle green with verdigris, and above the door a fanlight of leaded glass had 2 of its panes replaced with painted board. Peck had a key on a piece of tarred string. He fitted it into the lock and turned it with both hands and put his shoulder to the door, and the door opened onto a stone-flagged hall smelling of cold plaster and mice and old smoke. The hall ran the depth of the house to a garden door at the far end, and a wide oak staircase with a turned balustrade rose out of it, to a landing lit by a tall window whose lower sash had dropped an inch and let a draught along the boards. To the right lay the dining room, 30 feet by 20, with a marble chimney-piece intact, and a plaster ceiling stained brown in 3 places where water had come through. To the left lay the drawing room, paneled to the dado in painted pine, with a fireplace whose grate had been taken out, its iron sold or stolen, and a scatter of jackdaw sticks in the hearth from a nest fallen down the flue. Beyond the drawing room lay a small book room whose shelves still held perhaps 200 volumes bound in calf, most of them foxed and swollen, and a walnut writing desk with all its drawers pulled half open and empty of paper. Claire went through the rooms with the notebook open in her hand and a stub of pencil, and she wrote as she went, in Mrs. Lyle's shorthand of ticks and letters: roof, slate slipped over dining room, buckets, ceiling, drawing room, sound, chimney-piece, book room, sound, flue to be swept. She counted 12 rooms on the ground floor and 19 on the first, and she opened every shutter she could open and stood in every room for a full minute to smell it for damp. The kitchen at the back was a stone-vaulted room with a great cold range gone red with rust, a scullery beyond with a copper still bricked in and usable, a game larder with hooks and a slate slab, and a dairy floored in flag with a stone cheese press in the corner, and no roof leak that she could find. The kitchen court was cobbled and running with water because a downpipe had come away from the wall, and the stable block across it had 4 loose boxes, 3 sound and 1 with its manger stove in, and above them a hayloft with the door hanging on 1 hinge. At the north end of the house, at the top of the second corridor on the ground floor, was a plain paneled door with no handle, only a keyhole, and painted over long ago so that the paint had cracked in a pattern across the crack of the door itself, and showed that it had not been opened in years. Peck touched it with the back of his hand as they passed and said, That's the north wing, miss. Been shut since before my father. Claire wrote in her notebook, North Wing, shuttered, sealed, 40 years. And then she wrote under it, keys. And she closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket. She slept that first night in the small housekeeper's room off the kitchen because it had a sound flue and a bedstead, and because she meant to keep the fires going in the parts of the house she could reach before she tried to open the parts she could not. She lit a coal fire in the range at 8 o'clock in the evening and boiled water in a pan Peck had left her, and she ate a piece of bread and a piece of cheese from the parcel the vicar's wife had put in her trunk, and she slept in her clothes under her shawl and her father's greatcoat, and she woke at first light already thinking about the north door. For the first 6 weeks, Claire did not force it. She kept fires going in 3 chimneys, dried out the dining room, met each of the 2 remaining tenant families in turn at their own doors, walked the boundaries with Peck, made a list of every slate to be replaced and every gutter to be rehung, and sat up each night with her mother's ledger and the red notebook open side by side, entering what she had spent and what she had promised. But on a wet afternoon in the last week of April, with rain streaming down the windows and no work possible outdoors, she took a lantern and a chisel and a claw hammer from the tool cupboard, and she went to the painted door at the top of the second corridor and set the lantern on the floor beside her. There was no handle and no key. Claire slid the chisel into the crack of the frame at the level of the lock and tapped the butt of it with the hammer and watched the old paint split along its long, dry line. She worked patiently, moving the chisel down an inch at a time, easing the door outward against its hinges, and after 20 minutes, the tongue of the lock came clear of a wasted keeper, and the door swung inward on hinges that groaned but held. A cold, dry air came out at her, smelling of dust and old timber and something faintly of lavender, and she took up her lantern and went in. The north wing was 3 rooms in a row along a single corridor, all shuttered, all silent, and the shutters were the reason the air was dry. No window had leaked here in 40 years because no window had been open. The first room had been a bedroom. There was an iron bedstead stripped of its bedding, a washstand with a cracked jug, a chest of drawers, and a small fireplace whose hearth was clean swept, as though someone had made it tidy before leaving it. The second room had been a sitting room, with 2 upholstered chairs sunk into themselves, a small round table, and a bookcase whose glass doors were intact. The third room, at the very end, was a plain workroom with a deal table, a wooden stool, and along one wall, a set of shallow drawers of the sort a housekeeper might use for linen inventories, and above them, on a shelf, a japanned tin box the size of a family Bible. Claire set her lantern on the deal table. She took the tin box down. It was heavy for its size. It was fastened by a small brass clasp, unlocked, and when she lifted the lid, the light of the lantern fell first on a folded square of oiled silk, and beneath the silk on a canvas bag, and beneath the bag on a bundle of papers tied with faded pink tape. She lifted the silk aside and opened the neck of the bag, and inside the bag were coins. Sovereigns she saw at once by the milled edge and the color, and she poured a little of them out onto the table and counted. And there were, in 3 separate rouleaux, wrapped in scraps of newspaper dated 1817, 140 sovereigns in gold. She sat down on the wooden stool. She did not touch the money again for a long moment. She looked at the papers instead, and she untied the pink tape with steady fingers, and on the top of the bundle lay a folded letter addressed in a fine, sloping hand to whoever finds this. Claire unfolded the letter and set it flat on the deal table under the lantern, and read it through once without moving. Then she read it aloud, quietly, to the empty room, because she had been taught by Mrs. Lyle that a document read aloud is a document understood. My name is Margaret Sowerby, the letter began, and I was housekeeper at Ashcombe Hall for 31 years, from the summer of 1786 to the autumn of 1817, in the service first of Sir Henry Ashcombe, and after his death of his son. I was born in Cumberland in 1754, the daughter of a stone mason, and I came south into service at 15 and never went home. I was married for 4 years to a groom of this house, William Sowerby, and I had one child by him, a girl called Anne, who lived to the age of 6 and died of scarlet fever in the spring of 1793, and my husband died in the autumn of the same year of a hurt taken from a horse. And after that, I did not marry again, and I stayed on in this house because I had nowhere else I wished to go. I have put by, out of my wages, and out of small gifts, and out of careful keeping, 140 sovereigns, which is the work of 30 years and the whole of what I have. I have no living kin that I know of. The family here means to shut this wing when I am gone, for reasons of their own that I will not set down, and I believe it will stay shut a long time. I leave what I have to whoever finds it, and I ask only that they use it to keep this house standing and to be kind to the people in the village, who were kind to me when my child was buried in the churchyard here and when my husband followed her. There is a Bible in the drawer beneath this box in which I have written the dates of my Anne and my William, and there is a small silver thimble that was my mother's, and that I would like to stay in the house. I hope whoever reads this is not afraid. I was not afraid at the end. I have had a long life in a good house, and I have loved the people I have loved, as well as I knew how. Signed, this 14th day of October, 1817, Margaret Sowerby, housekeeper. Claire read the letter through a second time in silence. Then she folded it along its creases and set it on the table and opened the shallow drawer beneath the shelf, and there was a Bible bound in black leather with the names and dates written in the same fine sloping hand on the flyleaf, and beside the Bible, wrapped in a scrap of blue flannel, a small silver thimble worn smooth on its crown by a thumb long dead. Claire took the thimble out of the flannel and held it in the palm of her hand under the lantern. It was the size of the joint of her own finger. She thought of Mrs. Agnes Lyle, born in Yorkshire, in service at 12, and of her mother Harriet, who had kept the household ledgers in a slanted, precise hand, and of the red notebook in her pocket in which was written, in a housekeeper's shorthand, everything she knew about how to save a house. She closed her hand around the thimble and sat a while longer at the deal table in the north wing of Ashcombe Hall with 140 sovereigns on the table beside her, and did not cry, because she had been taught not to, and because there was no one there to see it if she had. She sat until the lantern guttered, and then she put the sovereigns back into the canvas bag and the bag back into the japanned tin, and she carried the tin down to the housekeeper's room off the kitchen and set it under the bedstead behind her trunk. In the morning she wrote in the red notebook, in her own hand now beneath Mrs. Lyle's older entries, a single line. North Wing opened, 27th of April, 1856, 140 sovereigns, and a letter from Margaret Sowerby, housekeeper. Then she made a list of what the money was to do in order, because Margaret Sowerby had asked that it keep the house standing and be kind to the village. And Claire meant to answer that letter with work. The roof came first. She sent Peck with a note in the morning to Thomas Bickle, slater of the village of Ashcombe, aged 52, a broad, slow man with a stoop from 40 years on other people's roofs, and Bickle came up the drive on foot after his dinner and stood in the forecourt looking at the south front for a long minute before he spoke. He said the slipped course over the dining room was the least of it, and that the valley behind the north chimney had rotted its lead and wanted 12 pounds of new sheet at the least. Claire asked what the whole roof would cost put right, and Bickle took off his cap and counted on his fingers and said 17 pounds if she found the timber, and 22 if she did not. Claire said she would find the timber. She paid him 3 sovereigns down out of the japanned tin and wrote it in the ledger as an entry against the general repair account. And Bickle touched his cap and walked back down the drive to send his boy up with the ladders in the morning. The timber came from a fall of oak in the home wood, 4 trees down in the January gales that no one had bothered to draw out. Peck brought his cob and a chain, and a boy called Reuben Wilkes, aged 14, the smith's second son, and between them over 3 days they snaked the trunks out to the yard, where the estate carpenter, one Josiah Hemp, aged 61 widower, who had worked at Ashcombe under Sir Henry's son and had gone home to his sister's cottage when the last steward left, came up unasked with his adze and his frame saw and offered to cut the rafters for his keep. Claire gave him his keep and a shilling a day besides, and set him a bench in the stable yard. He worked from first light to dusk, and did not speak more than a dozen words in a morning, and the rafters came out true. The pointing came next, and the gutters, and the downpipe in the kitchen court that had come away from the wall. Claire mixed lime mortar herself in a wooden trough behind the scullery, because Mrs. Lyle's notebook told her how to tell good lime from bad, and she had bought the lime by the hundredweight from the yard at the market town 7 miles off, and she pointed the lower courses herself on a plank between 2 trestles, her sleeves turned back and her hands white to the wrist. Bickle laughed the first time he saw her at it, not unkindly, and told her she pointed like a Yorkshire mason, and Claire said she had been taught by one, which was almost true. The tenants came next. There were 2 families left of the 4, the Ardens at the Low Farm and the Websters at Coldbrook, both in arrears, both waiting for the letter that would put them off the land. Claire walked to the Low Farm on a Tuesday morning in May with the red notebook in her pocket and sat at Mrs. Arden's kitchen table drinking tea out of a cup with the handle mended in wire, and she asked William Arden, aged 47, tenant farmer, what he could pay and what he could not, and she wrote his answers down in Mrs. Lyle's shorthand. She forgave him 11 pounds of the 16, owing on the condition that he lay 100 yards of hedge along the lane before Michaelmas, and Arden agreed and did not look at her while he agreed, because he was not accustomed to being spoken to that way by a girl of 18, and Mrs. Arden cried quietly at the range and pretended she had smoke in her eyes. Claire made the same journey to Coldbrook on the Wednesday, and struck a similar bargain with the Websters over the drainage of the wet field, and by Friday she had 2 tenants who meant to stay. By the end of June, the dining room ceiling had been replastered by a man called Nathaniel Frome, aged 39, jobbing plasterer out of the market town, who came for a week and slept in the hayloft and took his supper with Claire in the kitchen and told her, on the last night, that his own mother had been in service at Ashcombe as a girl and had spoken of Margaret Sowerby as a fair woman. Claire wrote the name in the red notebook that evening under a small heading of her own, People Who Remember. The kitchen garden came back in pieces. The walls were sound, 4 courses of good brick with a coping of local stone, and inside them was 10 years of bramble and nettle over what had been 8 long beds and a range of glass. Claire cleared the first bed herself with a billhook and a fork borrowed from Peck, and then a woman called Hannah Rudd, aged 31, widow of a shepherd, came up from the village and asked if there was work, and Claire set her at the second bed at 9pence a day, and her dinner, and Hannah Rudd cleared 3 beds in a week, and knew the name of every weed she pulled. They planted late potatoes, turnips, kale, and a row of broad beans against the south wall in the first week of July, and by August there were greens on the kitchen table that had grown inside the walls of Ashcombe Hall for the first time in a decade. Autumn came, and with it the settling that Claire had not looked for and did not name, The village found reasons to come to the house. Mrs. Arden brought a pat of butter on a cabbage leaf on a Sunday afternoon and stayed an hour at the kitchen table without saying much. And the following Sunday, she came again. And after a while, the Sunday visit was a thing that happened without anyone arranging it. The vicar of Ashcombe, one Mr. Edmund Hallowell, aged 66, thin and quiet and short-sighted, walked up the drive on a Thursday in October with a book he thought Claire might like from his own shelves. And after that Thursday, he came most weeks with another book and took the last one back, and Claire read them by the kitchen fire after her ledgers were closed. Peck's wife, Mary Peck, aged 44, laundress and mother of 4, came up on Mondays to help with the linen, because the copper in the scullery was too big for one person to work alone. And she and Claire boiled sheets and pillowcases together and hung them on lines strung between the lime trees. And Mary Peck told Claire the village news in a low, steady voice while she pegged, who was ill and who was mending and who had gone to service in the town and who had come home. Reuben Wilkes came up on Saturdays to sweep the flues and to sharpen the kitchen knives at his father's stone, and Claire paid him 2d a flue and a piece of cake, and he took the cake home to his mother wrapped in a bit of paper. By the winter of 1857, Ashcombe Hall had smoke coming from 4 chimneys in the evening, and a lamp lit in the housekeeper's room until 10, and travelers on the road above the valley saw the lights and knew the house was lived in again. The 2 remaining tenants had paid their Michaelmas rents in full for the first time in 5 years, and Claire had entered the sums into her mother's ledger in her own upright hand, and had written beside the totals, in pencil in the margin, a small mark of her own devising that meant paid without hardship. The books balanced. The roof did not leak. There was flour in the barrel, coal in the shed, and 41 sovereigns still in the japanned tin. And the villagers had begun to call her Miss Mason of Ashcombe, not because she had asked to be called anything, but because that was who she had become. In the second year, Claire took on a 14-year-old girl called Ellen Marsh, from a large family down in the lower village, as kitchen maid at £4 a year and her keep, and she taught Ellen Marsh in the mornings and evenings the way Mrs. Lyle had taught her, sitting at the deal table in the housekeeper's room with the red notebook open between them, showing her how to weigh out flour without spilling, how to skim cream without breaking it, how to write down what had been used and what remained. Ellen Marsh had a quick hand and a slow tongue, and was well suited to the work. On Sunday mornings, Claire walked down to the parish church with Ellen at her elbow, and she sat in the 3rd pew from the back on the north side, and Mr. Hallowell nodded to her from the reading desk, and after service the men touched their hats, and the women said good morning, Miss Mason. And Claire answered by name every one of them she knew, which by the end of the 2nd year was every one of them there was. The north wing she opened room by room, slowly, over that 2nd summer. She had the shutters taken down and the sashes eased, and she washed the windows herself with vinegar and newspaper the way Mrs. Lyle had taught her, and she had Josiah Hemp lift the boards in the 2nd room where a mouse had died under them a long time before, and she scrubbed the floors with soft soap and sand and left them to dry in the through draft. She did not change the rooms. She put the iron bedstead back as it had been, and the 2 upholstered chairs, and the round table, and she set the black-bound Bible on the small table beside the bed with Margaret Sowerby's flyleaf open, and she put the silver thimble in a small glass dish on the bookcase in the sitting room. The workroom she kept as her own writing room, and she moved the deal table under the window and set her mother's ledger and the red notebook upon it. And there she did her accounts in the afternoons when the light was good. Small rituals grew of themselves. On the 1st Sunday of every month, Claire opened the kitchen to any of the village women who wished to come and put down her recipes and remedies against theirs, and Mrs. Arden came, and Hannah Rudd came, and Mary Peck came, And old Mrs. Bickle, the Slaters' mother, came with a stick and sat by the range and told them how bread had been made in her grandmother's day. And Claire wrote what she was told into the back pages of the red notebook, under a heading of her own: Ashcombe Receipts, from those who know. At Michaelmas, she gave a dinner in the servants' hall for the tenants and the workmen and their wives, and there was a goose from her own yard, and a ham from the Ardens, and a barrel of small beer from the Rose and Crown, carried up by Peck. And 23 people sat down to eat at a long deal table under the low beams, and no one thought it strange that a girl not yet 21 sat at the head of it. At Christmas of the second year, the Duke of Ellingham sent word through Mr. Harding that he was satisfied to hear the house was standing, and that the arrangement would run its full term. Claire read the letter, folded it, and put it in the drawer of the writing desk in the book room with the tenancy papers. She did not answer it. She had nothing to say to the Duke of Ellingham that could be said in a letter, and there was still a year to run before he need be answered at all. The village, meanwhile, had made its own arrangements. When a slate went in a wind, Bickle was up the ladder before Claire had sent for him. When a lamb was born wrong at Coldbrook, Webster sent his boy up the drive to fetch Claire, because she had a steady hand from her father's dispensary and knew how to turn a lamb, and she went in her apron with her sleeves already rolled. When Ellen Marsh's little brother took a fever in the spring of the third year, Claire sat up 2 nights in the Marsh cottage with a poultice of Mrs. Lyle's mixing, and the boy lived. And after that, there was nothing in the village of Ashcombe that Claire Mason was not part of, and nothing in Ashcombe Hall that did not, in some quiet way, belong to her. In the autumn of the third year, the Duke of Ellingham came up the drive himself. He came in a hired chaise because his own carriage had been sold in London the month before, and he came without warning, and he came alone. Claire was in the kitchen garden with Hannah Rudd lifting the last of the main crop potatoes when Peck's boy ran down the path to say a gentleman was at the south door, asking for Miss Mason. Claire wiped her hands on her apron, walked round to the forecourt without changing it, and found a man of about 50 in a good but weary black frock coat, standing beside his trunk on the gravel she had weeded herself. He was thinner than she had expected. He looked at the house first and at her second. He said his name as though it still meant what it had once meant. And Claire said, "Good afternoon, Your Grace," and asked him in. She sat him in the book room by a fire she lit with her own hands, and gave him tea in one of the plain cups from the kitchen because the china had never been unpacked. He drank 2 cups before he spoke of business. Then he said, in the flat voice of a man who has practiced the sentence, that his affairs in London had gone badly, that a bank had failed, and a mine had failed, and a cousin had signed away what remained, and that he had come to ask whether Ashcombe Hall could be made to shelter him for a season while he settled what could still be settled. He did not say the word help, but it was in the room. Claire looked at him across the desk where the tenancy papers lay in their drawer and said Ashcombe Hall could shelter him and that he would take his meals in the dining room and that the blue room on the south front was aired and ready. She did not remind him of the terms of the letter she had signed at 18. She did not need to. He heard the omission and inclined his head. That night, after she had seen him to his room and set Ellen Marsh to lay a fire there, Claire went by lantern into the north wing and opened the shallow drawer beneath the shelf where Margaret Sowerby's Bible had lain. She had been through the drawer once, 3 years earlier, and had thought it empty beneath the linen paper lining. She lifted the paper properly now. Beneath it, flat against the wood, was a second bundle of documents tied with the same faded pink tape. And these were not Margaret Sowerby's. They were older. They were a copy of the marriage settlement of Sir Henry Ashcombe's daughter, dated 1809, and a codicil to Sir Henry's will, and a schedule of the mineral rights of the Homewood and the field called Long Peace, which the Duke of Ellingham had inherited along with the house and had chosen, or had been advised, to represent as worthless. There was a surveyor's letter from 1816 setting out a seam of good building stone under the west slope, and there was a valuation from a Shrewsbury firm putting the quarry alone at £900. Claire read the papers twice by the lantern. She understood then why the Duke had wished to be rid of the place quickly and quietly, and why he had wished it into the hands of a girl of 18 who would be presumed to see nothing. She folded the papers, tied them in the tape as she had found them, and put them in the drawer of the writing desk in the book room with the tenancy articles and the Duke's Christmas letter, and she said nothing that night to anyone. In the morning, she gave him breakfast, and, after breakfast, in the book room with the fire lit and the door shut, she laid the papers on the desk between them. She did not accuse. She said only that these had been in the house, and that she thought he would wish to know they were safe. The Duke looked at the papers a long time. Then he looked at her, and something in his face gave way that had not given way in London. He asked her quietly what she meant to do. Claire said she meant to keep Ashcombe Hall standing and the village fed, and that the quarry, if it were worked, would pay for both, and that she would be glad of his counsel in the working of it, if he cared to give it, on terms they could set down in writing. She said the terms would be fair. She said the house had taught her what fair was. The Duke put his hand flat on the papers as though to steady himself, and said he would be grateful, and it was the first time in Claire's hearing that he had used the word. That evening, Claire went again to the north wing, to the sitting room where Margaret Sowerby had kept her 2 upholstered chairs and her round table, and she set out on the table 3 things. She set out the silver thimble that had been Margaret Sowerby's mother's, and had come south from Cumberland in 1769. She set out the red notebook that Mrs. Agnes Lyle had put into her hand in the narrow room above the pantry at Marrowfield, its flyleaf reading, "For Claire, who sees what is worth saving." She set out her father's pocket watch, which had stopped on the day Edward Mason died, and which she had never wound. She stood a while and looked at them together on the round table under the lamp. A thimble from a woman who had lost a husband and a child, and had saved sovereigns shilling by shilling for a stranger. A notebook from a woman who had gone into service at 12, and had taught a girl of 14 everything she knew. And a watch from a country surgeon who had sat by other people's beds until he could sit no longer. 3 people who had loved her, or would have loved her, and none of them alive to see the house standing and the lamps lit and the village fed, and a Duke at her table asking her counsel. Claire, aged 21, stood in the room a while longer and then blew out the lamp. Claire Mason was 18 and had no family and no dowry. She had £42 sewn against her stays, a red notebook in her pocket, a stopped watch in her trunk, and a signed tenancy at £1 a year for 3 years on a damp country house a Duke had given her to watch her fail. It was the best £1 a year she ever spent. If this story sat with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who has been handed something other people called worthless, because those are often the people who know best what a house or a life is truly worth. And before you go, sit with this a while. What has someone once given you, expecting nothing to come of it, that in your own patient hands has quietly become the making of you? Tell us in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're listening from, and we will read every word.